Last week, Gamefreak made the announcement that Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield would be receiving DLC. This set the already fractured fanbase on fire. I mean, how could they not make a third game and sell us Pokemon Gun? Instead, they gave Inteleon a gun. What is going on? Today, we're going to talk about that on Food for Thought, a show that I'm bringing back for 2020. In just 5 seconds of comment diving, you can see that there's a bit of a misconception around this DLC. Unfortunately, a lot of people believe that you have to buy the DLC to obtain the 200 Pokemon that they're adding back into the game. These are returning favorites that were cut originally in Sword and Shield's release. Fortunately, you don't. Gamefreak is adding back those 200 Pokemon for free. With the DLC, you can catch them. With Pokemon Home, you can import them, or you can just simply trade with somebody who has the DLC, meaning those 200 Pokemon are back on everybody's game. Now that that's out of the way, let's actually talk about what happened to Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield and why the fan base is so fractured right now. And why, if you look at the community, we seem quite toxic. It was the end of an era. The Pokemon games on the 3DS had come and gone, and everybody was looking forward to the first Nintendo Switch game. Then they released Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, and everyone was like, cool, but where's the real one? Gamefreak actually, at the same time of announcing Let's Go, announced that the first real mainline Pokemon game will be coming to the Switch the following year. With this announcement, the fans were excited. We were waiting in anticipation for this game, and the announcement trailer hit, and it was everything we wanted. A new region, new Pokemon, Wooloo stole our hearts. And yet, in a couple weeks after, we got the news that the National Dex was being cut, and that there were no longer going to be all 1,000+ Pokemon in the game. This split the fanbase into two distinct factions. Those who were okay with not being able to catch them all, and those who absolutely refused the idea. They became known as the Dexers. Now, the Dexer group actually brought up a lot of good points while the game was in development and getting released. The Dexers pointed out the trees and how they look very, very low poly. They pointed out a lot about the Pokemon animations. They are the ones who went in and checked the models to see if Gamefreak told the truth about having to remake the Pokemon. And unfortunately, they did not. So the Dexers actually gave us a lot of information, but unfortunately, due to their insistence, it became a sort of nitpicking. Most of the people on the other side refused to listen to them. And while they have a point, I think there's still a lot of speculation. And unfortunately, we cannot clarify it all, as we ourselves are going to have to speculate. But as somebody who is currently developing a video game, I think I know exactly what happened and how Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield probably ended up being a much more difficult game to make than we thought. Game development is hard. Between each generation of Pokemon, Gamefreak has actually traditionally struggled. Now, between the Game Boy to Game Boy Advance games, that struggle wasn't necessarily as pronounced, as realistically, with no way to trade up, people weren't freaking out when you couldn't trade your Pokemon from Gold and Silver to Emerald and Sapphire. But by the time we got to the Nintendo 3DS, they had kind of figured out a way to move things forward, and with that came our first real indication that Gamefreak may not be able to change their engine very much. You see, between the DS and the Game Boy, we actually didn't get that big of a jump. In fact, we stayed on sprite graphics, and although the DS games looked great, they took forever to make. In fact, The original Diamond and Pearl release date was 2004, and we didn't get it until 2006, which is why we were on Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald for so long. We knew that they had some trouble with the engine. That part has kind of come out over the years, and that they had problems creating an in-depth post-game and making the game and releasing it on the new hardware. They did all of that and chose to delay it. And fans were actually kind of angry with them. You see, there were still issues. There were issues with the engine running very slowly. Frame rates on the game were wonky at best, and the game's pacing and story were odd. But at the same time, it had an extensive post-game, and it had a lot of legendary Pokemon that you could only get from special events, so hype still built around it. Fast forward to Pokemon X and Pokemon Y. Instead of focusing on an extensive post-game, this time they focused on making the core experience the best it could be. They also made sure that the engine ran properly, and they remade everything into a 3D asset. X and Y was a 24-hour affair, but we loved it. We told Gamefreak, yes, this is awesome. The deeper story, who cares if there was only a short little post-game where we had this whole thing with the Detective Looker, and we still don't know who Looker is, and he wasn't even in the game that we're currently playing. The problem is, Pokemon X and Pokemon Y are actually some of the lightest Pokemon games in the series to date. They decided to cut content in order to give us everything we wanted on the timeline they had originally set out. So instead of delaying it and making the game better, they made the game shorter, and we still loved it. We sent a very clear message to Gamefreak that you can cut content as long as the technological leap is great enough. And this is where the mindset for Sword and Shield most likely came from. Gamefreak knew they could make a game lighter in content and then sell it to us if there was a big enough jump. And to them, the wild areas, the Pokemon walking around, would be that big enough jump. The problem is, game development is complicated. Here is where my developer's insight comes in. When I see Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield, I actually see a game that was released unfinished. And they released it unfinished most likely for a number of reasons. One of those reasons being that merchandise and anime and card game type things were slated and ready to release. Essentially, Pokemon has become too big to slow down. The other thing is, they knew that they could add the content back. Granted, if Gamefreak were a bit more transparent with the fact that they were just going to add back Pokemon, people wouldn't have been so angry. But if they were transparent about it, then people would also wait for their favorite Pokemon to be added. There's a lot going on here that is really complicated, but I do need to address one thing, and that is the 3D models. I personally work with 3D models. When it comes to game development, I'm most of the time the one doing the model work. The difference between working with models in one engine to the other can be quite drastic, and sometimes you take a model, you import it to another area. So like say Blender to Unreal. And something happens and the model just doesn't look right. You then go back and you fix it and you tweak it and you make it look better. The change between Pokemon on the 3DS and Pokemon on the Switch might have been more drastic than we think. You see, I actually believe that Pokemon most likely actually switched to a brand new engine. One that was designed around the Tegra hardware, instead of the mobile processors that were in the Nintendo 3DS. This hardware change most likely made it so that Pokemon that never really needed to be updated had to be updated. Now, of course, there are people who pulled the models. They pulled the models, they are exactly the same, except when you look at what the exactly the same Pokemon are, you realize they're some of the most common, most popular, and honestly, the most seen outside of their Pokeball Pokemon in the game. These two groups are the most popular Pokemon in the game, the Eevee line and the Pikachu line. Pikachu literally has an animation, even though it goes unused most of the time, for surfing and flying. It has a unique animation for that. And in the new game, it has an animation for being spit out of that one pelican Pokemon. Like, Pikachu and Eevee are the exception, not the norm. More importantly, most of the Pokemon have been designed without the ability to walk. And as an animator, as somebody who works with 3D models, that is a problem. I'm not saying that it was impossible. Gamefreak very much could have with time. But let's give a real statistic here. If I were to take a Pokemon and animate it, and assuming they have a walk, run, idle, attack 1, attack 2, attack 3, probably an eating animation, I think, for the curry thing. We'll say 7 animations. Each animation, if I'm lucky, will take probably around 10 minutes. So that's 70 minutes, or 1 hour and 10 minutes per Pokemon on the low end. Multiply that by 1,000. So we're actually just gonna drop the 10. We're gonna go and just do it as 1 hour. So assuming it takes 1 hour per Pokemon, that is 1,000 plus hours of animation. That's 1,000 hours of animation if all of the models work properly. Now, you may be saying, but they're just gonna reuse the models. But there's more to a model than just a model. There's the skeletons, the weighting. Let's say Fennekin, because Fennekin was cut. Fennekin is an adorable Pokemon with an adorable Pokemon with an adorable evolutionary line, and it is well loved. Say Fennekin's walk cycle had its fur tufts clipping through its tail. Now we have to go back and change that so that it doesn't happen. Every single animation now has to be changed. And while I said it took 1,000 hours to animate it, it then is going to take an hour per Pokemon again to check those animations, and then an hour to fix it if there's a problem. Yes, Gamefreak has the manpower, but there's a lot going on behind just the models that could be a problem. And now we're gonna dive even further into speculation here. I personally believe that the DLC is funding the repairs of the main game. I personally believe that Gamefreak wanted to release a complete game, but had to delay it in order to do it. I think what most likely happened was Gamefreak had a timeline. They were like, okay, this new engine's done, let's start putting Pokemon. And as they started adding Pokemon, they realized some of them didn't work. Some of them didn't have the correct rigging to walk, to move. And then they went, okay, we can fix them. Some of them. And then unfortunately, they ran out of time. And that is a very real problem that happens in game development. A lot of cut content is not cut because of cost, but rather because of time. And so instead, they're releasing them as DLC, a plan that they probably didn't even think was possible because they said they weren't going to do it. Most likely what happened is Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield sold so well, because currently it is one of the best-selling Pokemon games, that Gamefreak decided it was worth it to release DLC to fund further development of the games. But again, that is some speculation from somebody who works on video games. Essentially, all of this rage, all of the backfiring that happened on Gamefreak could have been avoided. Could have been avoided if they were more transparent with us. If they said, hey, we are having difficulty with this one thing, please allow us more time, it would have been bad PR. We would have been happy, but It would have looked bad in the eyes of the press. It would have looked bad in the eyes of Nintendo. If they would have come out and said, we're adding the Pokemon as DLC after announcing that the Pokemon were cut, people would have immediately jumped to speculation saying they're charging us for Pokemon, and that would have been bad. It would have been worse if they announced that the Pokemon were going to be a DLC and then the games didn't sell and then they didn't have the money to make the Pokemon. And they essentially had to release a third game that fixed it in order to make back their losses. Essentially, I can see where Game Freak's decisions lied. They weren't trying to betray us fans. They aren't trying to axe your favorite Pokemon. I mean, Trubbish made it in. If Trubbish can make it in, anything can. And Trubbish probably made it in entirely because it's really easy to animate. Digressing a little bit, honestly, this fan base, this group of people that I consider myself a part of, we all need to just chill out a little bit. Game development is difficult, and the Pokemon games are bloated. Let's be real. There are 1,000+ Pokemon. 1,000. That means that in future installments, as this balloons up 100 Pokemon at a time, we could be easily looking by the end of this generation at 1,500 Pokemon in the Pokédex to catch, to train, to balance. I just want you guys to think about this for a moment because this might actually be a sign of something yet to come. We might be at the edge of when Game Freak can actually make them all. So, just think about that. Before you raise your pitchforks and attack a game development company for cutting your favorite Pokemon, remember, there are 1,000 of them, and they somehow hit yours.
Yeah, I choose you.
That was just some food for thought. Thank you guys for watching. That was just some food for thought. Thank you guys for watching. Wolfie, out.